In our daily lives, we inevitably encounter various cognitive biases. Did you know that over 60% of our daily decisions are secretly influenced by invisible mental traps? In just 0.3 seconds after you stumbled upon this video, your brain has already labeled it as trustworthy or not based on the title, color, and view count. And as you continue watching this content, you might be unconsciously filtering out opposing viewpoints. These cognitive biases lurking in our minds like viruses are silently shaping your career advancement, relationship choices, and even your life path. Today, I'm going to help you crack the code on 10 of the most dangerous thinking traps and teach you how to armor your brain with scientific thinking. Why do we automatically ignore news that contradicts our beliefs? And why do we get impatient when hearing opposing views? Well, it's all because of something called confirmation bias in our brains. This mental shortcut makes us actively seek out evidence that supports our existing beliefs while subconsciously dismissing or downplaying any contradicting information. Here's a mind-blowing research finding. Humans spend about 80% of their time consuming information that aligns with their own viewpoints, and this pattern keeps reinforcing itself over time. Let me give you an example. When you learn someone's zodiac sign or MBTI type, you might think you've figured out their entire personality. But what's really happening is that you're subconsciously filtering out any behaviors or traits that don't match your initial judgment about them. Have you ever noticed how you feel like you're getting a great deal when a store advertises original price $1,000, now only $500? But what if the original price was just $600? That's the anchoring effect at work. When making decisions, people tend to rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, mature, and use it as a reference point for all subsequent judgments. Even when this initial information is completely irrelevant, our brains get stuck on it like an anchor, making it hard to think outside that frame of reference. For example, when an employer offers a monthly salary of $8,000, you'll instinctively use that number as your baseline for negotiation, potentially overlooking that the industry average might actually be much higher. Here's how people make decisions based on what easily comes to mind, rather than actual facts and figures. For example, many think plane crashes are more deadly than car accidents, or that shark attacks kill more people than bee stings. But the numbers tell a different story. Mining is actually 220 times safer than driving, and bees claim 35 times more lives annually than sharks. This mental shortcut is called the availability heuristic. Mining's way judge how likely something is to happen based on how easily we can recall similar examples, not the real statistics. Our brains naturally take this shortcut to save mental energy, relying on whatever examples pop into our heads first. There's an interesting pattern at airports. Whenever there's major media coverage of a plane crash, security lines grow by 30%. People see these dramatic crash reports everywhere and start thinking flying has suddenly become more dangerous, even though the actual risk hasn't changed at all. Similarly, if someone knows a friend who quit smoking but still got lung cancer, they might think quitting doesn't help much. They're focusing on this one memorable case while overlooking the strong statistical link between smoking and lung cancer that's backed by countless studies. Have you ever caught yourself thinking that someone who reads philosophy books and speaks thoughtfully must be a college professor rather than a factory worker, or assumed a product with fancy packaging must be of higher quality? That's the representative heuristic playing tricks on your mind. The representative heuristic is our mental shortcut of judging things based on how closely they match typical patterns or stereotypes, rather than looking at actual statistical data. Our brains love pattern matching minus. It's a quick way to simplify complex decisions. Here's an interesting example from medical practice. When doctors see middle-aged male patients with chest pain and a smoking history, fitting the typical heart attack patient profile, they're more likely to diagnose a heart condition, even with limited symptoms. They might overlook other possibilities like acid reflux just because the patient fits their mental image. In criminal psychology, researchers have identified some common traits among offenders. For instance, people with thick eyebrows and large eyes are sometimes associated with violent tendencies, while those with small, slim builds might be stereotypically linked to theft. But remember, these are just patterns, not absolute truths. Here's how people often show bias in their thinking. When your coworker shows up late, you might label them as lazy or unmotivated, but when you're running late, oh, that's just because of the terrible traffic. Similarly, when others succeed, we tend to say they just got lucky, but when we achieve something, we're quick to credit our own hard work and abilities. This is what we call attribution bias in action. Attribution bias happens when we're not objective about explaining why things happen. Instead of looking at the full picture, we tend to make quick, oversimplified judgments based on our own assumptions. Think about how we handle success and failure. When things go well for us, we're quick to say it's because of our skills and effort, but when we fail, we blame it on everything else. MIDAR timing, unfair circumstances, you name it. Here's a classic example. During an argument between spouses, one might think their partner is being cold because they're just naturally selfish. That's trait attribution. Meanwhile, they're completely missing the fact that their partner had an incredibly stressful day at work. That's situational attribution. We often forget to consider these important contextual factors. Have you ever assumed someone was smart or kind just because they were good-looking, or believed a product must be high quality simply because of fancy advertising? This common psychological tendency is known as the halo effect. The halo effect happens when we take one notable characteristic about a person or thing, mixed like their appearance, wealth, or achievements, and use it to make assumptions about their other completely unrelated qualities. Think about it this way. Mixed when we see a business owner making charitable donations, we might automatically think they're socially responsible, overlooking any controversial business practices. Or when we enjoy a singer's music, we might convince ourselves they must be a good person with high emotional intelligence, even without any real evidence. This mental shortcut comes from our brain's desire to keep things simple and consistent. It's like taking a cognitive shortcut to make quick judgments. While this might make decision-making easier, it can also lead us to trust blindly or develop unfair biases. People often get so captivated by someone's positive traits, like their sense of humor or impressive education, that they completely overlook character flaws or fundamental differences in values. Have you ever joined a long queue at a bubble tea shop just because you assumed it must be amazing? Or found yourself sharing trending content on social media simply because it had tons of likes? This follow-the-crowd mentality is what psychologists call the conformity effect. Conformity refers to when people change their behavior or beliefs due to social pressure, trying to fit in with group norms and expectations. There are two main types of conformity. Active conformity happens when we genuinely agree with the group's views. Like when you see your coworkers learning a new skill and feel genuinely inspired to join them. Then there's passive conformity, where we outwardly agree but privately disagree. Like staying quiet in a meeting to avoid conflict, even though you don't support the majority's decision. Interestingly, research shows that collectivist cultures like Japan have about 30% higher conformity rates than individualistic cultures like the United States. You can see this effect clearly on social media platforms. When a video suddenly goes viral, people are more likely to watch it simply because everyone else is watching it. This creates a snowball effect where algorithms push the content to even more viewers, creating a classic herd mentality situation. Here's how people's brains work when it comes to gains and losses. Have you ever bought something you didn't need just because you were afraid of missing out on a deal? Or maybe you've held on to losing stocks, refusing to cut your losses? That's loss aversion at work. Might have a fascinating concept in behavioral economics. Loss aversion is pretty simple. We hate losing things way more than we enjoy gaining them. Research shows that the pain of losing something hits us about 2 to 2.5 times harder than the joy of gaining something equivalent. Think about it this way. If you find $100 on the street, that's great. But to feel as happy as you feel sad about losing $100, you'd need to find about $250. That's how much stronger our negative feelings about losses are. Here's a real-world example. When marketing something, saying sign up now to avoid a 10% price increase later works better than get a 10% discount if you sign up now. Even though they're basically the same thing, the first one taps into our fear of losing out, making it more persuasive. Have you ever found yourself in a heated social media debate, convinced that everyone must agree with me, or when shopping, believe this must be what most people would choose? Well, that's what psychologists call the false consensus effect, and it's more common than you might think. This effect is basically our tendency to overestimate how many other people share our beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. We often assume our views are more widely shared than they actually are. Think about it, when we're passionate about something, we naturally project our preferences onto others. Like when vegetarians might think surely most people care about healthy eating as much as I do, or when sports fans assume any rational person would support my team. It's also a kind of self-defense mechanism. Smokers might tell themselves lots of people think occasional smoking isn't harmful to feel better about their habit. We do this because our brains crave social validation and cognitive consistency. It's comforting to think others are just like us. Social media makes this even trickier. When we see posts with lots of likes, we might think this must be what everyone believes. But remember, algorithm-driven echo chambers can really amplify this bias. The false consensus effect shows how we tend to view the world through our own lens. But here's the thing. The world is much more diverse than what we see from our personal perspective. To avoid this trap, try actively seeking out different viewpoints and relying on actual data rather than gut feelings. Have you ever rushed into buying something just because it was limited time offer without really thinking if you needed it, or felt confident about a surgery with a 90% success rate, but hesitated when told it had a 10% failure rate? This is exactly what we call the framing effect in behavioral psychology, when the same information presented differently can totally change how we make decisions. The framing effect shows how the way we present information, whether it's about gains versus losses or positive versus negative outcomes, it can really influence people's choices. It all comes down to loss aversion from prospect theory. Basically, we feel about 2 to 2.5 times more pain from losing something than pleasure from gaining the same thing. Think about it, when the government says 95% of people have health insurance coverage, it sounds way more appealing than saying 5% of people are uninsured. Same facts, totally different impact.